We've made it to the third Sunday of Advent, and we're very close to celebrating Jesus' birth. Next week, we'll read the announcement of Mary's pregnancy and get about the closest thing that Matthew has to Jesus' birth narrative, but we're not quite there yet. This week is very much a reminder that Advent is all about anticipation. There's somebody on Twitter who, a year apart from each other, said antici, and then the next year followed it up with patient. It was beautiful. It's a wonderfully meta joke. But right now on this third Sunday of Advent, we're still waiting. We are waiting with Israel for the coming Messiah. We heard today in Isiah a message to a people who are very much waiting. We're also waiting for Jesus to come back when he will restore the world to what it always should have been and give us a perfect new creation. But yet we wait. And if you're anything like me, waiting is not fun. I'm not a very patient person. I'm sure anyone who's known me for any length of time knows that, but here we are, waiting. This reading from Isaiah is written to the people of Israel when they are barely a people anymore. The best people can tell is that this section of Isaiah was written to the Israelites in exile in Babylon. Their home wasn't really their home. They have been carried off by the Babylonians who conquered them and settled in who knows where. The first 39 chapters of Isaiah are the lead up to that exile. It's all these prophecies of doom and destruction and wow, you guys are terrible and God's going to take care of that. There's no justice anywhere. But then the second kind of half of Isaiah from chapter 40 on is very much different in tone. Instead of saying things like doom to everybody, it says things like comfort, comfort my people. It tells of God's servant who will be filled with God's Spirit, who will bring justice to God's people when they cry out for it, who will preach good news to the poor, release to the prisoner, recovery of sight to the blind, and liberation to the oppressed. And all nations, not just Israel, will put their trust in God's servant. How different that is from the first half of Isaiah, which describes Israel like a vineyard that God planted and put a wall around, and then when the vineyard started to produce bad fruit, he took the wall down and brambles and thorns came in. It's a much different picture because the Israelites at this time in their lives didn't need to hear doom and gloom and destruction. They didn't need to hear that they needed to shape up. They needed to know that it was going to be okay. And so God says this to his people, basically, it's going to be okay. The exiles at this point didn't know when they were going to see their home again, if they ever would. The second generation had grown up hearing about these stories of home, the stories of the temple, the stories of what God had done for them, but this generation just wasn't seeing it. And as far as they were concerned, even their God wasn't as good as the one the Babylonians had. You see, in ancient times, if you were conquered by another people, it didn't just mean that you were conquered. It was that their God was more powerful than your God. And so when the Babylonians came in and crushed the Israelites, they had to have been thinking, oh, well, Marduk is better than the God that we've known. Because Marduk's people won. So right before this section of Isaiah, we get this beautiful picture of God putting all the other gods on trial, challenging them to prove that they're God, so that God can then step in and say, no, I've got this. I'm always in control. It's going to be okay. Only God's prophets announced that the exile would happen. And God's prophets announced that they would return after 70 years. The other gods are frauds. And then God announces his servant. Now, this servant isn't just for the people of Israel. The servant is for all nations. It's not just Israel who will see justice done. It's not just Israel who will see their sick healed, but it's all nations. And so, 14 generations from the exile, God's servant appears. His first visitors, according to Matthew's gospel, were some men from the east, some Gentiles who came to celebrate the new king. When he grows up, God's servant teaches humanity that the kingdom of heaven is found in humility and in love. But not everyone is pleased about it. Our gospel lesson picks up after Jesus had healed some people on the Sabbath. What horrible thing that was. According to the religious leaders of the time, it was a horrible thing. And they started to plot against Jesus for healing someone on the Sabbath, for bringing justice on God's day. And it's at this point that we read from Matthew today that he links what Jesus is doing to what's prophesied in Isaiah. That not only is God in control, not only is it all going to be okay, but that's starting right then with Jesus. The things that Jesus did started to fulfill that prophecy from Isaiah. And while Jesus did bring forgiveness of sin and the promise of eternal life, when we look around in our world today, it often seems like there isn't much justice. The powerful still take advantage of the ones out of power, just as they did in the times of the prophets. The rich still take advantage of the poor, just like they did in the times of the prophets. There is still sickness and suffering and pain. There's so much that we still cry out and need to know from God that it's going to be okay. And so we find ourselves, along with Israel, waiting. We wait for God's servant's return, when he will bring that perfect justice into the world, when we will realize all of these promises that have been made to us, and we won't just hear the words that it's going to be okay, because it is. And we wait for that time when all of the things that bother us in this life aren't anymore. All of the sickness, the pain, the sin, the corruption of the world will be gone. And it will be so much more than just okay, because it will be perfect. This Advent season, we have our hope strengthened, because as we prepare for Christ to come back and set all things right, we can see the fulfillment of all of God's prophecies that happened in Jesus. And we can look at what Jesus did on earth and see that if God will fulfill those things, he'll also fulfill the ones that we're still waiting for. And so we take hope in our waiting. And we are reminded that we don't wait in futility, we wait in hope. Because if Jesus can come to earth and be God's servant, we can trust that he will come back and set to right all the things that are wrong and raise us up to a new perfect life in him and live together with him in a new and perfect creation where all of these things, all the sickness, the pain, the oppression are gone. And we live in God's light and we live with God forever.